Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Kat slipped into the hallway, shaking the raindrops off her umbrella. The house was flooded with light. Ed had lit all the lamps, as usual. He stood at the kitchen island flipping pancakes. The air smelled of vanilla and fresh fruit, and the sound of the cooking show on the TV was a quiet background wave on the walls. "You made it just in time." He turned around, tossing the last pancake on the griddle and catching it with such ease that Kat, as usual, couldn't contain her smile. 5 minutes more, and I'd have been without supper. She took off her cloak, tossed it on a chair, and walked over to Ed, peering over his shoulder. "I didn't think you'd make pancakes. That's my specialty." He, still grinning, turned around and hooked her chin. "You know, I had to earn your girlfriend's approval somehow. They think I'm too boring anyway." Kat laughed ringingly, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "Well, you'll definitely surprise me this time. It smells unparalleled." Her gaze slid involuntarily to the suitcase in the corner, neatly packed with a ribbon on the zipper. In a couple of hours, she and her friends would be leaving for their long-awaited vacation. Kat could already hear Emma calling impatiently in anticipation of her leaving the house. Ed, finished with dinner, reached for his glasses. "Let's celebrate this great journey of yours. I poured some of that wine you love. Just don't forget that this is no reason to fly away forever." He winked, and Kat returned the favor. As she sipped from her glass, Ed sat down across from her, placing his elbows on the table. "Just promise me one thing. You'll come back safe and sound. I've already booked theater tickets for next week. No excuses, understand?" His voice sounded light, but Kat sensed genuine concern in those words. She wrapped her palm around his hand and squeezed it. "I promise. I know you won't even overcook your pancakes without me." Ed laughed, and that genuine, unclouded joy suddenly filled the house. The first night of vacation seemed like something out of this world to Kat. She and her friends were sitting on the terrace of a small bar lost between the whitewashed walls of the local houses. The breeze from the sea was warm. The rustle of the palm trees echoed their laughter, and the first cocktail was pleasantly relaxing. Music was playing around, unhurried, shimmering guitar sounds. The friends were discussing plans for tomorrow, visiting the market, sunbathing, new cafes. Kat listened to them, nodding, but felt that her thoughts were somewhere far away. She closed her eyes for a second, letting the music carry her away, when suddenly she heard an unfamiliar voice nearby. "You're laughing so hard. You must be telling some really good jokes?" She turned around. Standing in front of her was a man in a light-colored shirt with rolled-up sleeves, slightly disheveled hair, and a cocky smile. His dark eyes seemed to be studying her, but not brazenly, but with a subtle challenge that she felt, not sure why it ticked her off. He held out his hand, tilting his head slightly. "My name is Lucas." Kat gave her hand in a machine-like gesture. "Kat," she said, and immediately felt her friends catch their breath. They watched her every move, as if she were entering uncharted territory. Lucas let go of her hand and sat down across from her. The friends immediately found an excuse to go to the other end of the terrace, leaving the two of them alone. It was so sudden that Kat didn't have time to object. "Are you resting here?" he continued, looking at her with such interest as if he could see right through her. She nodded. "We just started. The first day we decided to just relax, not rush into anything." Lucas smiled. "That's a great start. I'd suggest you watch the sunset from the most beautiful point on the coast. Do you like sunsets?" "Who doesn't?" Kat replied, but she realized she sounded too formal. Lucas didn't seem to notice. "So tomorrow I'll show you a place. But promise me it'll stay our little secret," he said, leaning slightly toward her. His voice was soft, but there was something in it that made her heart beat a little faster. The evening continued. Lucas told stories of his travels, of how he had given up everything for this life by the sea. His words were filled with a freedom that beckoned to her like a sweet scent. She caught herself laughing at his jokes, though she couldn't have repeated them even a moment later. His gestures were smooth, his gaze confident, and every time he looked at her, she felt herself straying from her usual rhythm, as if she were being pushed to the edge, forced to take a step into the unknown. As the evening began to fade, Lucas stood up, holding out his hand to her. "Come on, I'll show you a place." It'll only take a couple minutes. It's close by. Kat, already slightly relaxed by the cocktail and his words, felt her legs lift themselves. She glanced at her friends, who looked at her and nodded expressively. She'd been pushed into this story like she'd been pushed into the water from the get-go. Lucas led her deeper into the streets, to a place where the silence was almost tangible. They stopped at a small square, flooded with the soft light of old lanterns. He looked at her and, without asking permission, gently touched her hand. "It's always quiet here. This is my favorite place," he said. "And now it's my favorite place next to you." He leaned a little closer, his voice even lower, warmer. Kat suddenly felt her heart beating like she was preparing to jump. Lucas leaned in, and before she could say or do anything, she felt his lips on hers. It happened so quickly and naturally that she didn't even have time to think about whether it was right, whether it was good. She responded to his kiss, and she was overcome with a feeling she hadn't felt in years. When she returned to her room, her friends were already asleep. She quietly closed the door behind her and leaned against the wall. Her thoughts were jumbled threads, but one thing was clear. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive. And that frightening, tantalizing sensation wouldn't let her go, wouldn't let her sleep. Kat could no longer ignore the attraction that came from Lucas. Every day, he found a way to surprise her. He'd show up unexpectedly with a small bouquet of flowers, or he'd take her to a quiet coffee shop where they'd have a long talk about life. She laughed at his stories, which would have sufficed for a dozen lives. And in his voice, she heard something she had missed for years. They walked along the shore until their feet were submerged in the cold water, sitting on the rocks, watching the sun sink below the horizon. Lucas always knew what to say when her thoughts got too loud. Kat was starting to open up. Her questions were getting deeper, and his answers were getting more sincere. He listened to her stories about her childhood, about the dreams she never dared to realize, about the fears she hid even from herself. In his eyes, she saw not only understanding, but also support. He seemed to know her even better than she knew herself. It confused her, but at the same time filled her with a warmth that had been almost forgotten. With Ed, everything was simple, familiar, predictable. Lucas, on the other hand, was unpredictable, a storm that left no room for the usual calm. Every morning began with a decision she could never make. She tried to keep her distance, but Lucas found her gaze, her hands, her smile. He would catch her eye, make her laugh, and forget where she was. She felt herself becoming addicted to his touch, his voice, his scent, but she couldn't tell if that was good or bad. She just knew that this man was filling an emptiness she had carried inside her for far too long. One evening, they sat on the old wooden dock with their arms around each other's shoulders. Lucas told her about his childhood, how he had lost his parents at an early age. His words were simple, but there was such honesty in them that Kat couldn't look away. She suddenly realized that she felt lighter around him than she ever had with Ed. It was scary because it broke her familiar world, but at the same time it filled her with new strength. When they kissed, she felt everything else fade away. Not the city, not her status, not her obligations. None of it existed. Just his lips, his hands, his breath. Kat knew it was wrong, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't care. She didn't try to justify herself, didn't look for explanations. She just let herself be. But the night was coming to an end, and Kat suddenly realized that her vacation was almost over. She could no longer run away from what was waiting for her at home. The thought of returning made her heart clench, not because of fear of Ed, but because of the realization that her life would no longer be the same. Her choices, her actions, everything she did on this vacation would stay with her. She looked back at Lucas, who was still holding her hand, and realized tomorrow everything would change, because tomorrow she was flying home to her husband. Kat got home late in the afternoon when the only light in their house was already burning in the soft glow of the table lamp in the living room. Ed was sitting on the couch with one arm behind his head watching an old movie. When he saw her in the doorway, he smiled, turned off the TV, and got up to greet her. "So, how was your vacation?" He pulled her against him. His embrace was tight, warm. Kat froze for a moment, feeling his strength, and closed her eyes. Lucas's face flashed before her, for a second his smile, his dark eyes. She pulled away quickly, trying not to look at her husband. Okay, it was fine, she said, walking to the back of the room. She avoided his gaze, as if he could read her mind, as if everything that had happened was written on her face. Kat settled back in her chair and looked around, trying to regain a sense of familiarity. Here was her house, her things, Ed, but everything felt foreign. She felt like a guest, like someone else was living here instead of her. Ed sat down across from her, put his hands on his lap, and leaned forward. You've changed somehow, Kat. Maybe it's the rested look, or maybe I just missed you. His words sounded sincere, but there was a note of wariness in them. She looked up, trying to keep her tone neutral. The vacation was intense. It's hard to switch right away. Ed seemed to accept her answer. He smiled, but his smile seemed odd to her, as if he was sure he didn't know something important. Kat returned to her suitcase, beginning to pull clothes out of it and throwing them all over the bed. Each of her movements became slow, as if her hands themselves didn't want to let go of the things she had brought back from the other world. She could hear Ed pacing the room, his footsteps becoming more and more cautious, as if he didn't want to disturb her. At night, Kat lay in bed, turned away from the wall, and listened to her husband's steady breathing. He fell asleep almost immediately, as he always did. She closed her eyes, but the image of Lucas came back to her. She remembered their conversations, his voice that sounded like music, his touch that had something primal, alive in it. She couldn't just forget the way he'd looked at her, as if she were his only light. Those memories were robbing her of her peace. She wanted to go back, to regain that sense of freedom that their bond had given her. Ed began to notice a change. The next day, when she made him coffee and set the cup on the table, he asked quietly, "Are you sure you're okay? You seem, I don't know, different somehow." Kat held her gaze on the cup, as if she could find the right answer there. "Just tired." "It's okay," she said, trying to put a firmness in her voice. But Ed wasn't backing down. "Kat, something's going on. You can tell me the truth. It's not like I'm a stranger." He didn't raise his voice, but there was a certainty in his words that scared her. She looked up at him and saw the worry in his eyes. "Ed, there's nothing going on. Just give me some time. This vacation has been weird. I need to get used to regular life." She turned away and started wiping the table, pretending this conversation hadn't left a trace. But it had. Ed didn't say anything more. He left for his room, and Kat heard him close the door quietly. Being alone was all she wanted. Late that night, she sat in her chair again, staring at the blank wall. Ed walked into the living room, slowly lowered himself onto the couch across from her, and was silent for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Kat, you've never been so aloof. Can you tell me what's wrong?" His voice was soft, almost pleading. Kat felt her heart sink. She wanted to tell him how she felt, but she couldn't. Lucas lived on in her mind, and her love for Ed didn't seem real to her anymore. He waited for her answer, but she remained silent. Her silence was heavier than any words. Ed stood at the bedroom window, staring out into the darkness. Something inside him was clenching like a spring about to go off. Kat had gone to bed a little earlier, citing fatigue. It wasn't the first time she'd done that. They used to go to bed together, discussing the day, making plans, teasing each other with little jokes. Now she just tucked herself in without saying a word. Ed tried to convince himself that it was just a consequence of the long trip, the change of scenery, but he couldn't shake the lingering feeling that something was happening to her. He walked quietly into the living room, trying not to make any noise. The empty room greeted him with silence. Ed sank down on the couch, wrapping his arms around his head. For the past few days, he'd felt cornered. Her detachment, her short answers, her barely perceptible smiles, it all hit him like drops of water sharpening a stone. He remembered how she used to laugh at his jokes, how her eyes had brightened when he told her his plans. Now her gaze was blank, like she was somewhere far away. He couldn't stand it. Picked up her phone, lying on the kitchen table, and turned on the screen. She'd never put a password on it. Ed excused himself. He just wanted to make sure he was worrying for nothing. His hands trembled slightly as he opened applications. There was nothing suspicious in the messengers. Emails were filled with standard notifications. At the gallery, however, Ed lingered. Among the vacation photos of her friends, beaches, and sidewalk cafes, he found a few shots he hadn't seen before. One of them showed a man in a white shirt, leaning slightly toward Kat, as if whispering something to her. Ed felt his heart skip a beat. He didn't know this man, had never heard of him. Who was he? Why was he in this photo? And why had Kat never mentioned him? Ed closed the gallery and put the phone away. He glanced at his watch. 3 in the morning. His body refused to sleep, his brain frantically searching for explanations. He picked up the phone again, checked his browser history. Nothing out of the ordinary. But that picture, he couldn't get it out of his head. Ed realized it might not mean anything. Maybe it was just a local guide who was helping them find the best places. But he remembered the way she'd come home, the way her gaze had been directed anywhere but at him. It didn't fit the picture. Ed got up and walked to the bedroom. Kat was asleep, turned back against the wall. Her breathing was even. He stared at her for a few minutes, trying to find an answer in her face. She looked calm, serene, as if nothing troubled her. But something inside him whispered, "She's far away from you, Ed, very far away." He returned to the living room, sat down on the couch, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes. Anger and helplessness overwhelmed him. He felt betrayed, but he couldn't say in what way. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but he was afraid he couldn't handle the truth. Ed clenched his fists, trying to calm himself. He knew that he had to find out everything to the end, that he had to find out what was behind this change. He didn't know where it would lead, but it was impossible to back down. In the morning, Ed decided to find out everything. He didn't raise his voice. His questions sounded even soft. He still couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Who is that man?" His voice was almost a whisper. Kat slowly turned her head. There was no fright in her gaze, but there was realization. She knew she couldn't hide anymore. It's one of the locals. He was helping us find a good spot on the beach." The words fell like stones. Ed stared at her, keeping his eyes on her. His fingers gripped the phone tighter. He knew she was lying. It was a lie told too quickly, with no attempt at persuasion. He rose slowly, took a step toward her, then another. He didn't threaten, didn't wave his arms, but his presence was becoming more and more palpable. "Kat, I need to know the truth. I found the photo. I found correspondence. This isn't just a local." "Who is he, Kat?" She closed her eyes, as if trying to chase that question away, like chasing away a nightmare. Then she exhaled heavily and pulled the plaid away. "It's Lucas," she said, lifting her head and meeting his gaze. There was no emotion in her voice. It was just a name, but there was a whole universe behind it. Ed didn't move. There was a flicker of pain in his eyes that was immediately hidden behind a mask of calm. "Lucas," he repeated. "And who is he to you?" Kat was silent for a long moment. Her shoulders slumped, her gaze settling on her hands clutching the edge of the plaid. "I can't explain it. He was another world. I don't know how it worked out. Ed, I didn't want it to. But when we talked, when he looked at me, I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what happened to me." Her voice shook, but she didn't cry. She just sat there and spoke, as if she were confessing not to her husband, but to herself. Ed didn't move from his seat. He watched her, listening to every word, but he didn't interrupt. He knew that if he interrupted her, she might shut down, might withdraw into herself, and never say anything more. Wanted to understand. He tried to understand why the woman he loved was now sitting in front of him talking about another man. "Do you still love me, Kat?" His voice was so quiet she barely heard him. She looked up, eyes full of uncertainty and sadness. "Yes, I do. But I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know who you and I are anymore. Things have gotten so complicated." Ed lowered his gaze to his phone. The picture showed her smiling in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. His heart clenched, but he didn't show it. "So you still love me," he repeated. He looked at her for a long moment, then turned and sat back down on the bed. "Good," he said, as if to himself. He looked at her again, already more calmly. "The choice is yours now, Kat. I won't talk you into staying. I can't force you to be with me. You have to decide who you are, what you want. I won't fight for you if you don't want me to." His words hung in the air, and there was silence in the room. Kat sat still, as if trying to digest his decision, his words. Her gaze flickered to the window again, but it was only night behind the glass. Her world was falling apart, and she didn't know how to fix it. Ed didn't say anything else. He just got up, headed for the bathroom, leaving her alone. Kat heard the sound of the door closing and realized it was up to her now. She felt for the first time in her life that she was at a point of no return, from which there was no turning back. Ed stared silently at his hands folded on the kitchen table. He hadn't touched the cup of tea, which had long since gone cold in hours. Kat, sitting across from him, didn't know what to say. There was a tense silence in the room. She tried to find some words that would make things right, but nothing came to mind. Ed finally looked up and said, "I can't live like this anymore, Kat. I can't." His voice was quiet, but there was a hardness to it. He met her gaze and continued, "I'm letting you go. If you want to be with him so badly, if it really makes you happy, go to him." Kat opened her mouth, but couldn't say anything. She looked at Ed, trying to comprehend what she had heard. He continued, "I can't fight for us if you don't want to do it yourself. I don't want to keep you here by force. Maybe this is the chance you need." He pushed back his chair, stood up, and walked slowly to the door. "You have time to pull yourself together. I'll give you that opportunity, but I want you to realize that if you leave, there's no going back." Ed shook his head, sighed, and walked out of the kitchen. Kat was left sitting in silence. Thoughts whirled through her head. She went back to her memories of Lucas, his gaze, his confidence, his words that seemed so real to her. They were the moments that filled her with light. Now Ed was giving her a chance to return to that light. But was it that easy? After an hour, Kat made up her mind. She packed her things into a small suitcase, trying not to look at the generic pictures on the walls. Every picture of her and Ed being happy now looked like a reminder of how far apart they were. The drive back to Lucas was like time travel. In her mind, everything seemed the same. She imagined how happy he would be to see her, how his voice would fill her with strength again. She delved into her memories, trying to find a justification for what she had done. Her heart beat harder as she approached his door. She knocked and, hearing no answer, she opened it ajar. A girl met her on the threshold, young, smiling, with loose hair and a light summer dress. Behind her in a chair sat Lucas. He leaned back, holding a glass of wine in his hand. When his eyes met Kat's, there was a look of surprise on his face. He set the glass on the table and slowly stood up. "Kat," he pronounced. Kat looked at the girl, then back at Lucas. What's going on here?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Lucas stepped closer, but stopped a few paces away. He paused for a moment, then said, "Kat, I didn't know you were coming back. I wasn't expecting you." Kat felt her legs go absorbent cotton. "I thought that. You said that Lucas interrupted her, but gently. "Kat, it was a light fling. Nothing serious." His words hit her harder than she expected. "A light fling?" she asked again, trying not to betray the tremor in her voice. He spread his hands. "Kat, you knew what you were getting into. You have a husband. You said yourself that this was a vacation, that there would be no repercussions. We both knew it wouldn't last." His words sounded calm, but they lacked the warmth she remembered. Kat looked back at the girl who was watching them with a slight chuckle. Lucas added, "I'm sorry, Kat, but I don't need more than I had. I'm not looking for a serious relationship." Kat felt something shatter inside her. She couldn't look at him anymore. She turned and walked out the door. The sound of her footsteps echoed down the hallway. She walked, unable to make her way, trying to realize what had just happened. Lucas's face, his words, it all jumbled in her head. Her world, which was already cracking at the seams, was now finally falling apart. She stopped at a street corner, closed her eyes, and exhaled. Ahead was a night that seemed endless. Kat stood in front of the door of her house for a long time, hesitant to enter. The suitcase seemed heavier than it really was, as if the past she was trying to escape from had suddenly filled it to the brim. She raised her hand to the bell, but instead of pressing it, she stood for a moment longer, listening to the faint sound of the wind. Lucas's words rolled around in her head again. "I wasn't expecting you." It was a light fling. They sounded like a taunt, like a judgment. Finally, she pulled herself together and turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, and the familiar smell of home hit her in the face. She stepped slowly inside, set her suitcase against the wall, and noticed that the light was on in the living room. Ed was sitting in an armchair, a file folder on the table in front of him. When he saw her, he stood up and looked her straight in the eye. Kat opened her mouth to say something, but he beat her to it. "I warned you," he pronounced. His voice was calm, but there was a weariness in it, as if he'd been through everything that could happen a long time ago. He walked over to the desk, picked up a folder, and held it out to her. "These are the divorce papers. I don't want any scandals or relationship issues. Everything has already been said. It was your choice." Kat stood stiffly looking at the folder. A wave of protest rose up inside her. She wanted to explain, to justify, but she couldn't find the words in her head. She began, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Kat, you made up your own mind. I gave you a choice, and you made it. Now it's my turn." He turned away and walked to the window, looking out at the street. "I can't go on living my life, pretending things are the way they used to be. I'd rather start over." Kat picked up the folder, but instead of opening it, she just held it in her hands. She couldn't believe this was really happening. For a second, she thought it was a nightmare she was about to wake up from. But when Ed turned his back to her, he made it clear this was reality. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.